You're listening to Retail Disrupted, a podcast that explores the latest industry developments and the trends that will shape how we shop in the future. I'm your host, Natalie Berg. Today's episode is going to be a little different because it is only me on the podcast. I actually can't remember the last time that I didn't have a guest. I think I learned pretty quickly that recording an episode on your own sounds easy and straightforward, but actually it is incredibly hard. And especially if you have a brain like mine that is constantly going in 1,000 different directions, I just find it really hard to focus and to kind of come up for air. So I don't have a script today. I'm completely winging it. And I appreciate that not only is it easier for me as the host when I have a guest, it's also probably a lot more interesting for you to be listening in on a conversation rather than just hearing me drone on about retail. But that is what I am going to be doing today. So bear with me. And if this is your first time listening to the podcast, may I suggest that you go back and listen to some episodes where I speak to people before you decide to leave a rating or review. That's my one request today. Okay, so what I wanted to do today was to share with you some updates and also some insights based on conversations that I've been having with journalists. This is a very busy time of year for retail. There's a lot of interest in the sector. So I've been speaking to journalists about all kinds of weird and wonderful things. And I thought it would be nice to continue that conversation here on the podcast. This week has been an unusual week for me. I spent the day at Silverstone earlier this week. If, like me, you are not a racing fanatic, you might not know that Silverstone is the home of the British Grand Prix. So not your typical day out for a retail analyst. But it was a great event. It was hosted by PMC, and we heard from a number of retail leaders, particularly those in the technology space, talking about how they're digitally transforming their businesses. We heard from Nick Baton, who is the former CEO of ASOS and Matches, and he talked a lot about cultural change. And also, he spoke really candidly about how his leadership has evolved over the years. I'm going to be writing a blog about everything that I learned throughout the day. So sometime over the next couple of weeks, you can check out nbkretail.com and read all about that. I also had the opportunity to sit down with a couple of retailers and record an episode for the podcast, which will be coming out next week. I spoke to Jeanette Copeland, the technology director at Ann Summers, and also Paul Edney, the technology director at Primark. Paul and I talked about all the amazing things that Primark is doing around click and collect. So lots to explore there. And if you are not already subscribed, now is probably a good time to do that so you don't miss our conversation next week. Let's move on now to talk about the news. We're going to touch on three things today. There really is no theme. It's a little bit of a jumble. It's really just the things that I have spotted and have thought were interesting, or things that journalists have been asking me about, and I thought I would share my commentary with you. So we're going to talk about Amazon. We're going to talk about Vinted, the pre-loved online marketplace. And we're also going to talk about advent calendars. I told you it was random. So first up, we have a couple of breaking news stories from Amazon. And how exciting is that to be able to comment on breaking news stories on a podcast? I don't normally get the opportunity to do that. There are rumors flying around Germany that Amazon is about to terminate their online grocery service. Germany is a really tough market. It's dominated by the discounters. And it sounds like Amazon is moving more towards a service provider role, so delivering groceries for other retailers. Now, this should come as no surprise if you have followed Amazon closely over the years, as I have. They have been dabbling, experimenting, and iterating with lots of things, but especially with grocery. Grocery has always been a difficult market for Amazon to crack. there's a ton to say here, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I would say that I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm going to be covering it next week. So let me just clarify that. I have Boris Planner, who is a former colleague of mine. He's based in Frankfurt. I've known Boris for like 20 years, and he is my go-to person for all things German retail. He has kindly agreed to come on the podcast next week, and we're going to dive into this in a lot more detail. But one thing I would say here is that Amazon needs to decide at some point whether they want to be the retailer in grocery, I should say, whether they want to be a direct competitor to other grocery retailers, or whether actually they just want to be the infrastructure. They want to be the rails that the retail sector runs on. I certainly know which of those two options is more lucrative, which is more in Amazon's wheelhouse. So really interesting to see the news from Germany. And again, it hasn't been confirmed by Amazon, but it sounds like this is the direction of travel. Now, the second breaking news story from Amazon, and this is arguably a much bigger story with much wider implications for the sector. Amazon has launched a new storefront on its site called Amazon Haul. It's only in the US right now. It's in beta mode. Everything is $20 or less. The majority of stuff is under $10, and some things are even less than $1. Categories include fashion, home, lifestyle, and electronics. Delivery is not what you would expect from Amazon. We tend to expect stuff to turn up within 1 to 2 days. Delivery of these items is going to take 1 to 2 weeks. Now, if all of this sounds really familiar, well, then you've probably guessed by now that this is Amazon's answer to Temu and, to a lesser extent, Shein, the Chinese disruptors that have come up time and time again on the podcast. We've known this was coming for months now, and in fact, Maya and I recorded an episode. It's episode 45. We recorded it back in July. It's called Amazon Must Disrupt Itself. We talked about all of this in that episode. So I'm not going to rehash that, but I would encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. I do want to say one thing here, though. I think it's really interesting, the use of the word haul. Branding really isn't Amazon's strong point. And Maya and I said when we recorded back in July that they were going to have to differentiate. Yes, they had to respond to Temu. Yes, they had to respond to Shein. They need to keep innovating and, as we said in the podcast, disrupting themselves. That disrupting the status quo, not standing still, because the market is moving so quickly, and it is easy to go from being the disruptor to the disrupted. So Amazon, to their credit, is taking action. There's a whole sustainability question here as well, but I digress. I think from a branding perspective, it's never going to be easy to differentiate this offering from their core offering. And I think how they manage that, it's so delicate, it's so tricky. The word haul implies that you're going to fill up your basket. And that's what Amazon wants you to do. So the more that you buy, the more you're going to save. Amazon says you'll get 5% off orders that are $50 and above, and 10% off orders $75 or more. And given the very low price point, I mean, you're going to have to buy a lot of stuff. So watch this space. Go back and listen to episode 45 if you're interested in hearing more. And I'm sure it will come up again on the podcast. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk to you about is Vinted, the pre-loved fashion marketplace, the peer-to-peer marketplace. I spoke to the Wall Street Journal about Vinted, and the specific question from the journalist was, what is it that makes Vinted special? What makes them unique? And also, are they a genuine threat to fashion retailers? Now, before I answer both of those questions, I just want to preface this because I'm conscious that I have a global audience and maybe you don't all know Vinted. If you're in the US, you'll know ThredUp, you might know Depop, but Vinted has been a huge disruptor here in the UK and in Europe. They have really broken the mold, and it's been really interesting to kind of watch their journey. They are making money now. So I spoke to the BBC earlier this year about that. They are profitable, which is really unusual for this kind of marketplace. And they are really having an impact on the industry. eBay, for example, has scrapped seller fees, and that for all categories. They started with fashion and now it's across everything. And that really is a direct response to Vinted because Vinted doesn't charge any fees for the seller. So, what is it about Vinted that makes them so special? I think it's their ability to offer customers value without sacrificing values. And there's a third element here. It's the fact that they're able to do this in a way that is totally frictionless. Frictionless for the buyer, frictionless for the seller. It's just easy. They've removed all the barriers. And that is a sweet spot that no other retailer has been able to hit. So value, values, and frictionless experience. I think it's an incredibly relevant platform for how people want to shop today. Affordability is still really important, right? Especially in the current climate. But so is convenience. We don't want to sacrifice the kind of digital touch points, the digital experience that we've gotten so used to. We also want sustainability and we also want community, maybe to a lesser extent, we want community. And so there is a little bit of a social element here, not as much as Depop, but there definitely is a community. And I think that Vinted really taps into all of those consumer needs in a totally brilliant way. From a consumer's perspective, a few things. There is the feel good factor. You're saving money. You're doing your bit for the planet. And again, there's no real hassle. And that is what keeps you coming back to the platform. Most people understand the need for circularity in fashion, but it has to be accessible, right? It has to be financially accessible and it has to be digitally accessible. We talk a lot about the intention behavior gap on this podcast. You know, ask any shopper, any consumer in a survey, do you want to buy more sustainably? And they're all going to say yes. But what do they actually go and do after they complete that survey? You know, shoppers don't want to sacrifice things like convenience. They don't want to pay extra for sustainability. The onus is often on the retailer. So I think Vinted kind of touches on all of these things. There are no sacrifices to be made. You can be frugal. You can do your bit for the planet and everyone's happy. The other important point here, just to build on the frictionless point, shoppers today are really intolerant of friction, right? We are living in this on-demand era where anything we want is just a couple of taps away. And you know, the same goes for sellers on the platform. The sellers and buyers are often the same people, right? I mean, I just checked my Vinted account. I've been using it for I don't know, a Christmas jumper, the things that, you know, you don't really want to buy new or have to think about. And it's just easy and cheap and you feel less guilty about buying. So I don't use it that much, but I just realized I have £6 in my account, which will probably make me go back to the platform and use it there. And that is what they've done, right? They've created this ecosystem. And so it's really important that sellers have that same slick, frictionless experience. I know that in the past, Vinted has said that sellers can list an item within 2 clicks. So I thought that was interesting, you know, being able to list an item quickly, seamlessly, and without any fees. That is really just removing all the barriers. And the result is this continuous flow of new products being added, which drives more buyers to the platform. Those buyers, again, they often become the sellers, and it just creates this kind of flywheel effect, something we talk a lot about when we're talking about Amazon. So that's sort of it. And in terms of whether or not they are a threat, I mean, the journalist I spoke to said that there are, and I didn't realize this, but there are some hardcore Vinted shoppers that now will only buy from Vinted. They've just don't ever leave the platform. And I think it is interesting. It's also, I mean, I imagine that's a really small percentage of shoppers, and most people want that variety. But it's interesting just to see how the stigma around buying secondhand has been completely shed. You know, secondhand or pre-loved is totally normalized. It's cool. It's celebrated. And it's also now accessible to a digitally native demographic, to the Gen Z shopper that has grown up with technology and wants, you know, doesn't want homogenous high street styles, but wants that individualistic style and still get the thrill of a bargain. But you can also find items that are unique or better quality because you're getting brands for a lower price. So I think, it touches on a lot of consumer needs right now. Really, really relevant format. The last thing we are going to be talking about on today's episode is advent calendars. Now, you may have noticed that there has been an absolute explosion in advent calendars. We've seen such a proliferation of choice here. It's not just about 3-pound Cadbury's chocolate advent calendars. I mean, there's advent calendars for everything. So I have been asked about this by 3 different journalists just in the past few weeks. And it's been really interesting to put together some thoughts and also to do some digging into, or just to, spend some time structuring my thoughts to think about why this is actually happening. The first thing I'm going to do with you, though, is I'm going to share a very brief history of the advent calendar, because I was asked to do this for Marketplace Radio, which is a American radio program. And then I also spoke to the BBC for a piece that went live over the weekend, and I will link to that in the show notes as well. So, firstly, how did it all get started? Well, like a lot of Christmas traditions, the advent calendar started in 19th century Germany. By the way, when I said I didn't have a script, I totally have a script for this part. So this is not my area of expertise. Okay, so what would happen? Well, Protestants would mark the days leading up to Christmas in a number of different ways. So they might light a candle, they might tick chalk marks on a wall or door, or they would hang up a religious picture for each day. The first printed advent calendar was created by someone called Gerhard Lang. This was in the early 1900s, and Gerhard was apparently inspired by a childhood memory of his mother taping sweets to a piece of cardboard for each day of Advent. He took the idea further by cutting little doors into the cardboard, and instead of finding chocolate behind the doors like we do today, you would find a biblical picture or a biblical verse. And that is really how the modern Advent calendar began. Now, a little bit of extra history for you, because it's really interesting what happened next. So these advent calendars pretty much disappeared during World War II, because of paper rationing. And also there was a Nazi ban on printing calendars with images. Fortunately, after the war, production picked up again, and these calendars evolved to become less religious and also to include some of the things we find in calendars today, so chocolates and toys. So that's just a little bit of history. The next question I was asked was about novelty advent calendars. When did they begin? Why are we seeing such an explosion? I think the idea for a novelty advent calendar has actually existed for a while now. So for the past, 10, 15 years, we've seen advent calendars for gin, cheese, socks, fancy chocolate, all kinds of things. But today you really can, as I said at the start, you really can get an advent calendar for just about anything. There are so many food and drink options, everything from advent calendars for protein bars to Nespresso coffee pods. Like, you can get anything. Beauty, of course, is a category that has absolutely exploded, and that's what I was speaking to the BBC about. But you also have toys, jewelry, pets, super obscure things like chili sauce and instant noodles. And those are real things, by the way. If you go on Amazon, you can get each of those calendars for about 15 pounds. Okay, so why is this happening? Well, I think a couple of things. Firstly, it goes without saying, the way that we shop today is dramatically different to just 5, 10, 15 years ago. Now, in the UK, a decade ago, just 12% of retail sales took place online. Today, it's more like 25 to 30%. Now, that's created a lot of opportunities for brands, but the one big downside is that it's a lot harder for shoppers to discover new products in an online setting. So if you're shopping in a store, you might pick up a dress and try it on. You might sample some makeup. You can't do that online. And so I think a lot of brands are recognizing that advent calendars are a great way to get new products into the hands of the consumer. And obviously the ultimate goal here is to acquire and convert new customers. Shoppers still want to treat themselves. They want good value, and they want that element of surprise. The other thing we need to call out here is that the advent calendar explosion that we're witnessing has also been fueled by social media. The whole unboxing trend is very compatible with an advent calendar. We are literally opening up little doors and discovering new products. Advent calendars tend to sell out anyway, at least the best ones do. And so if an advent calendar is going to go viral on TikTok, well, that is just going to add to the sense of urgency. And on the flip side, I think shoppers will know very quickly if an advent calendar isn't worth it. There was a great example of a Chanel advent calendar. It was priced at, I can't remember the exact price, but it was over like 500 pounds. It was, as you'd expect, a luxury advent calendar. And that one went viral for all the wrong reasons. So, there's a lesson there. This was a couple years ago, and TikTokers were saying it wasn't worth the hype. That message quickly spread to millions of people. And, that's the risk today. There is nowhere to hide. There's so much pressure on retailers to make sure that these calendars and really anything that they're offering to customers is going to be of excellent value. And then there's one final point here around timing. Black Friday, I did a podcast about Black Friday last week. It is no longer a one-day event. It is a month-long event. And in fact, this year, I noticed that John Lewis, Currys, and Boots all launched their Black Friday deals on Halloween. And that is the earliest I've ever seen. So how does this relate to advent calendars? Well, if shoppers are starting their Christmas spending in October, maybe early November, but if they're starting their Christmas spending earlier, well, then that creates an opportunity for retailers to reach this captive audience, to target them with advent calendars, higher margin advent calendars, and capture some of that early spend. So I think that's also played a role. Okay, that is everything from me for the week. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. And make sure to check back next week when I will have not one, not two, but 3 guests on the podcast. We are going to be talking about Amazon Fresh in Germany. And also, we're going to be hearing from the technology directors at Primark and Ann Summers. In the meantime, have a great weekend. Thank you for listening to Retail Disrupted. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, please leave a rating or review or share it with others. It really makes a difference.